For more resources, visit rymonline.org.
The Local Youth Worker is a daily podcast that's centered on 5 questions each week. Ranging from the practical to the professional, we're looking for answers to the questions you're asking. Whether you're in full-time, part-time, or even volunteer youth ministry, this podcast is for you.
Hey everybody, welcome back to our Friday show. We've been speaking with Julie Lowe all this week about teens and technology and some of the issues that come up from that. And those who listen to the show know that we often talk about books on our Friday show. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit, as well as a forthcoming book that Julie is working on right now. But some of those helpful books that I know that we've mentioned on this particular podcast and then on other podcasts, one that comes to mind is Andy Crouch's Tech-Wise Family. One thing I've said about that book before is just that it's a timeless book, that no matter how technology changes, I think 10 years from now, 20 years from now, you'll be able to pick up that book and get some helpful practices that I feel like are fairly balanced, similar to ways in which you've discussed technology this week, Julie. Is that one you've checked out?
Yeah, really enjoyed that one. And the neat thing about reading what other people are suggesting and doing is it just gives you more options. So instead of having a really rigid way of practicing technology, you're able to see there's freedom and liberty to do it differently, but with great wisdom. So that's the pleasure of reading some of these different books coming out for families.
Absolutely, because again, as we've said, this is all fairly new, territory that we're embarking on, and so it's just helpful to start having some resources now to point people to and to look to. And another one of those is Tony Reinke's 12 Ways Your Phone is Changing You, which is a really thoughtful book, a helpful book that hits on a lot of different categories. But have there been any other books or articles or anything you've stumbled across that has been helpful?
Yeah, a book that we were passing around at CCEF that I found really thought-provoking was called Reclaiming Conversation by Sherry Turkle, I believe. And again, that's probably one of the places I resonate well with. We are losing the ability to communicate with one another. Kids are losing the ability to authentically, have meaningful relationship because of technology and pseudo-relationships. So she makes a lot of really fascinating points in that book that I find really helpful. There's also a book called Public and Permanent by a man named Richard Gurry. I think I'm saying his name correctly. He's got a nonprofit, I think, in New Jersey, not a believer that I know of, but he makes a really good point that I've made over and over again with my own kids, and that is everything you put out there is both public and permanent. And if you practice that in your day-to-day life and in anything you're doing digitally, it'll spare you of some of your decisions that you're going to make. If every decision, everything you post this could be both public and permanent, what I posted, when I let the whole world see it, and when I want it to be there for the rest of my life, would it make you think twice about what you're doing? Just a really good message to be instilling. It's that stewardship, that digital consciousness, and accountability.
Absolutely, and that's one I've heard a few people bring that one up. I want to say maybe your podcast with Walt Mueller. That might be where I first heard about that, and have not been able to pick that one up yet, but I remember Sherry Turkle as well. I want to say that Reclaiming Conversation might be in a trilogy of books, because I know she released one. I was looking this up as you mentioned it, called Alone Together. And then I think the third is Life on the Screen, and I can't remember when all of those came out, but I think it was a trilogy of books that she had put together from some of her research. So yeah, those are very helpful. And you do think just the title alone, Reclaiming Conversation, you do wonder the implications of this generation. So many who haven't sat down and actually had conversation. That most of their quote unquote conversation is text on a screen, and just the implications of that years down the road. But those are some helpful ones to bring up. Well, any others that come to mind before we segue into talking about your forthcoming book a bit?
Yeah, I think you hit some really good ones. And a lot of times in those books, they'll actually recommend others as well.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, would you mind just telling us a little bit about the book that you're working on? When is that going to be released, and what you're dealing with there?
Sure. So it will be released, I hope, by late October. It's being put out by New Growth Press, and it's called Childproof. And it's based on learning to parent by faith rather than formula. So hopefully the premise of the book that really shines forth is some of the conversation we had this week that there's no formula to good parenting. There's great biblical wisdom and principles, but then we as parents and adults really need to be expert at understanding the kids in front of us and making decisions based on knowing them well, knowing their strengths and their weaknesses and their aptitudes and disabilities and where they're prone to sin and temptation. And then really saying, all right, Lord, how do I parent the child you've given me? And as you know, with multiple children, that can be a little overwhelming because now you've got multiple personalities and multiple strengths and weaknesses and multiple needs. But what that does is it means I really learn to rely on faith and wisdom before the Lord. And I'm really seeking Him to help me love well rather than depending on a formula to raise a family. And it also gives tremendous liberty that I don't have to look at other families and say, my kids have to be like them or I have to be like them. I think we really fail our families when we are looking for formulaic approaches.
Yeah, that sounds very helpful. And again, just some good perspective on parenting, not thinking of it as formulaic and just following. If you follow this how-to guide, you'll raise perfect children who love Jesus.
Right.
So yeah, that's something we'll definitely be looking out for, and maybe have you back on the podcast to talk about that book when it's released, Lord willing.
Sure.
Well, Julie, this has been really helpful for me just to sit down and talk with you, and I appreciate you giving of your time so generously, and pray that others are blessed by this conversation that we've had. So thanks so much.
My pleasure.
Thanks so much for tuning in this week to the Local Youth Worker. As always, we hope you've been encouraged and equipped in your call as youth workers. If you take time to rate this podcast on iTunes, that would greatly help us. As always, we want to thank Joe Deegan for providing the music and encourage you to go out and purchase his newest CD, Cover and Title Page, which you can find at iTunes. See you guys next week. Have a great weekend.
Oh, come and buy without money. Oh, come and feast without pay.